about modal logic, but I will first go on to justify why modal logic should be a thing. Why can't we just be satisfied with classical logic? Let us look at the statement if P then Q. In classical logic, you have got vacuous truths. If the antecedent is false, then the material conditional will always be true. This is exemplified by the statement, if Trump is the president of India, then Paris is in Italy. Because Trump is not the president of India, this material conditional will always be true, no matter if Paris is in Italy or not. As a result of classical logic, it is defined to be true. But this isn't really intuitive. If someone says, if Trump is the president of India, then Paris is in Italy, you won't really say, hey, you just say the true statement. It doesn't seem to reflect what we mean in natural language when we say if P then Q. You can formalize it by looking at these two theorems derived by Bertrand Russell, and these two theorems have been known for a very long time before Russell published his results. It's just that in his work he formally derived it from very fundamental atomic axioms. So the first theorem basically describes vacuous truth. If the antecedent is false, then the material conditional will always be true. You can look at the truth tables, the last two rows. P is false. No matter whether Q is true or false, the material conditional will always be true. And the second theorem is basically a law of simplification. This is also kind of unintuitive, but it is not really vacuous truth. Instead, it basically says that if the consequence of the argument is true, then the material conditional will always be true. You can look at P. Whenever P is true, no matter Q, if Q then P will always be true. Again, this is also kind of unintuitive. Let Q be I am in Singapore and P be 1 plus 1 equals to 2. Because 1 plus 1 equals to 2 is true, then you imply that if I am in Singapore, then 1 plus 1 equals to 2 will be true. The problem with really encoding natural language implications in terms of material implication is that statements like this will be absolutely true, even though they don't really make much linguistic sense. So this is also a result of classical logic defining P then Q as being equivalent to this logical statement. And C.I. Lewis wanted to change this conception of material implication, so he introduced a modal primitive operator, the diamond operator. It is known as possibility. It reads as possible that something. So diamond P means that it is possible that P. In modern times, you can introduce a necessity operator given by a square symbol. Lewis didn't really use this representation in his papers, so I won't be using this that often now. It's only more for abbreviating things, because the necessity operator is not a primitive operator. You can derive it from the possibility operator. If it is necessary that P, it means that it is impossible that it is not P. Because when I say necessary that P, it means that in all possible worlds, P is true. Therefore, it is impossible that there is a possible world that P is true. If I encode the previous statement with strict implication, which is what Lewis is trying to get at, he's trying to say that when I make statements in language, if P then Q, it is not a material conditional. It should be encoded as a strict conditional instead for every single if then statement. So the statement, if Trump is the president of India, then Paris is in Italy, it is the same thing as saying it is impossible that Trump is the president of India and Paris is not in Italy. So when I make the statement, I'm essentially saying that there exists no possible world in which in the same world Trump is the president of India and simultaneously Paris is not in Italy. The problem is that I can think of such a world, P and not Q can be true in a possible world without leading to any logical contradiction. Therefore, it is not impossible. So, because this part, the right hand side, is false for the statement that I made about Trump, that means that the left hand side will always be false, because it's a strict equivalence, and truth will be transferred through strict equivalence operators. And it makes my statement, if Trump is the president of India, then Paris is in Italy, now false. So if I interpret this counterintuitive statement with a strict implication, it will give me a false truth value, instead of using material implication, which will give me a truth value of true. So it is now much more intuitive. Let us formalize the idea of modal operators with the original system created by Lewis. The first axiom states that conjunction is associative. Sorry, not associative, it is commutative, and which means that the order of conjunction doesn't matter. Second statement is a statement of simplification. The third statement is a statement of identity. Fourth axiom is an axiom that the conjunction operator is associative, which means that the order by which you group it doesn't matter. And then there's your double negation, which is an axiom in classical logic too. After that, you have got axiom 6, which is a hypothetical syllogism. It shows that the strict implication operator can be transmitted. It can be transmitted across a conjunction. Number 7 is modus ponens. Modus ponens takes the form: if P, then Q. P, therefore Q. It is one of the most fundamental proof techniques and rule of inference in classical logic, and obviously it should be the case in modal logic, because in natural language we certainly use modus ponens all the time. If you don't do your homework, you ought to be punished. You did not do your homework, therefore you ought to be punished. This is an example of modus ponens. Number 8 is contraposition. In classical logic, when you say P then Q, it is equivalent to saying not Q then not P. What Lewis did is he essentially added a possibility operator in front of both propositions and called it a day. And we are going to show after this that using a biconditional operator in axiom 8 actually leads to a very unintuitive result. And this will actually influence Lewis to weaken this axiom and do away with the biconditional and replace it with a strict implication, a unidirectional strict implication. Definition 1 is justified just now in terms of natural language. Definition 2 is similar to the definition of the biconditional operator in classical logic, but instead of using material implication, I use strict implication now, because Lewis doesn't really like material implication. And let us now proceed with the result, the unintuitive result of axiom 8. The Emil post actually showed that axiom 8 will lead to modal collapse. Modal collapse is a phenomenon in which all truths will be necessary truths. P strictly implies that it is necessary that P. For example, if let's say in my world P is true and Trump is the president of the United States of America, this will strictly imply that in all possible worlds P is true, which means that in all logically conceivable worlds Trump is the president of the United States of America. But the issue with this kind of argument is that you can easily think of a possible world where Trump is not the president of the United States of America, and it doesn't lead to any logical contradictions. So modal collapse is actually quite deadly to modal logic because it turns the entire concept of necessity upside down. Any truth becomes necessary, and this also implies that there will be no contingent truths. There will be no truths that are possible but false in our world. And let me show you how it was derived historically. First, you just take your axiom 8 shown on the right side. You take axiom 8, you apply the biconditional definition 2 to it, and you show that the reverse strict implication is true from axiom 8. Thereafter, you imply the strict implication definition 1 to it, to both sides of the strict implication applied to this part, and then you apply it to this part. You will expand it like this. And thereafter, I call this the inverse of axiom 8. But essentially how do I put it? You just flip it around. Essentially, flip it around. Because axiom 8 shows that strict conditionals are, you can take the contrapositive. So when I take the contrapositive of it, I take the reverse contrapositive of it, I get this back. Thereafter, I am going to substitute all the Q with not P. This is a valid operation, because as described later on in this set of slides, Lewis actually allowed for uniform substitution of propositions, meaning that as long as you take the same proposition and you substitute it with another proposition in all cases, then this move will be a valid move in his system of modal logic. So I take all instances of Q, I replace it directly with the negation of P, I'll get this statement. Alright, I'll get this statement. And then I apply double negation to the left hand side. I'll get a simplified form, and then P and P will imply that P is true, because P and P essentially means that P and P is true. And to show that P and P strictly implies P, I look at axiom 2. I take axiom 2 and I perform uniform substitution on the Q in axiom 2 into a P. Axiom 2 will tell me that P and P strictly implies P. I apply this, I'll get this, the final line here. Moving on, I just copied down the final line for convenience. And then over here, I'm not working on this line anymore. I'm taking axiom 2. I take axiom 2, I copy axiom 2 down. I replace all instances of P in axiom 2 with impossible that not P. And I replace all instances of Q in axiom 2 with not impossible that P. The line, the tilde here, represents not impossible. It was introduced some time ago, but I forgot to talk about it. The tilde here essentially represents negated diamond. The negation and a diamond together, they can be represented by tilde. So tilde and the negation operators in this case are very different. In classical logic, sometimes they type the not with a tilde, but over here in modal logic, especially in this system of modal logic, we take tilde as being equivalent only to impossible, not possible. So after performing the substitution, I'll get this. Axiom 2 will turn into this. And then I look at this line and I combine it with this initial statement using axiom 6. by the associative principle, because strict implication transmits through a conjunction, and this thing are true, it becomes a conjunction. So I can take the P, I can push it onto impossible that not P. So I get P strictly implies that it is impossible that not P. And when I replace the tilde back with the more primitive symbols, I show that P strictly implies that it is impossible that not P. And impossible that not P is the same thing as saying necessary that P. So I prove that it is necessary that P implies that it is necessary that P. And this shows that no contingent truths exist. So nestled within the original system here that Lewis had established, nestled within this is the theorem of modal collapse. This system implies that contingent truths do not exist, that all truths in our world will be necessary, and this is a very unintuitive result, and we do not want this result to be in this system, or else it will defeat the purpose of even having a necessary operator. Nothing will really make sense, and it obviously doesn't match up with our natural language. So you realize that to derive that modal collapse, you had to take only one side of the biconditional of axiom 8. You only have to take one side. The other side of the biconditional does not lead to modal collapse. So what he did was he replaced axiom 8, instead of having a biconditional here, he replaced it with a unidirectional strict implication. By doing so, I call this axiom 8 prime. It doesn't lead to modal collapse of necessary truth. And he settled the issue of the lack of contingent truths in his axiomatic system. And then after that, he published even more systems. In 1932, he published 5 different axiomatic systems. The system S1 are all the axioms except for the contraposition axiom 8. Other than the axioms of that system, he now clearly stated the rules. Rule number 1, uniform substitution. When you perform uniform substitution of propositions, you will form substitution instances that will be logically equivalent. You can substitute individual propositions, you can substitute propositions linked with logical connectives. They are all allowed. Rule 2 is the substitution of strict equivalence, which is across the biconditional operator. So if you have P if and only if Q, by this rule, it means that P equals to Q. And for any instance of P, you can substitute it with Q and you will get the same logical result. The third rule is adjunction, which is that whenever two propositions have been inferred, then you can infer their conjunction. And the fourth rule is strict inference. If the antecedent and the material implication have been inferred, then you can infer the consequence by using modus ponens. This is the rule of modus ponens. So this is the modal system S1. When you take S1 and you add a new axiom, you will get the modal system S2. This new axiom is known as a consistency postulate. And the importance will be seen more when we study modal systems more in depth, when we talk about Kripke systems in the future. But as of now, you can just know this as a consistency postulate. System S3 is S1 plus the weak contraposition axiom 8 prime, which we have demonstrated just now. So the more axioms you add to a system, the stronger a system becomes. And now we're going to look at a very interesting result. So this applies to all systems, including the weakest system S1. If you have realized, if you have got a system Sk where k is an integer, as k increases, the strength of the system increases because you basically add more axioms. So this applies to all axioms, including the weakest. This applies to all systems, including the weakest axiomatic system S1. B5 is essentially the double negation axiom, and a logician, I think his name goes by McKinsey, can't really remember, but he proved that B5 double negation is a redundant axiom. You can actually derive double negation from the rest of the axioms in the system. So it is not an axiom. He showed that it's actually a theorem of system S1, and by extension a theorem of all other stronger systems. So let me state the proof sketch. First, we demonstrate lemma 1. Lemmas are essentially intermediate theorems that you use to prove a result. Lemma 1 is an identity lemma that you can derive from the axioms of S1. P strictly implies that P. If P is true, then it is necessary that P is true. Lemma 2 is another. It looks very similar to axiom 1, but axiom 1 shows that when conjunction is commutative, it is unidirectional with regards to the strict implication. But lemma 2, you can derive that this commutative property is actually a strict equivalence. P and Q if and only if Q and P. In lemma 3, you prove the other direction of the strict implication B5. You show that not P strictly implies that P. And then, after having these three lemmas, you can then prove the theorem that P strictly implies that not P. And in this entire process, you completely disregard B5 and you do not use B5. If you have an entire proof that doesn't use B5, that ignores B5, and then you prove B5, it obviously shows that B5 is redundant. Oh, and I realized something. I should be calling B5 A5 instead of B5. This is a naming problem on my part. Let's just pretend that this one says redundancy of A5. I'm referring to the same thing. I'm referring to the fifth axiom over here, the double negation axiom. This is what I meant by B5 just now. And I'll correct myself and say A5 from now on. Let us first prove lemma 1. We first take axiom A3 and restate it, the axiom of identity. And then we take the axiom of simplification, restate it. To the axiom of simplification, to all instances of Q, we replace it with P. As I mentioned just now, you derive this theorem. And with this theorem, its conjunction with A3 will give you this true statement by definition 2. So you are essentially using the biconditional operator. You can think of it as combining these two to form the biconditional operator and then adding a conjunction. So now we look at axiom A6, copy down axiom A6. To axiom A6, we substitute all instances of Q with P and P. We substitute all instances of R with P. I will derive this statement. So we combine this statement with this statement here. By combining these two statements, and you apply axiom 6 once again, the strict implication will transmit from P all the way to P strictly implies P, because the antecedent here is the same as the consequent here. By axiom 6, I can prove that P strictly implies P, QED. Now let us prove lemma 2. We take axiom 1. To all instances of P, we substitute it with Q. And to all instances of Q, we substitute it with P. By doing so, we actually get the reverse. You can think of the reverse of axiom 1. You can think of its complementary also. So these two, when you combine it together using the definition of strict equivalence, by using the definition of the biconditional operator, you get a biconditional operator and an equivalent sign. So that's how you prove lemma 2. To prove lemma 3, we first take lemma 1, which is the identity lemma. To all instances of P, we substitute not P, which you will get this. Alright, now is the trickier part. You take definition 1. Alright, you take definition 1. To definition 1, to all instances of Q, I substitute it with not P. I'll get this statement. This statement, I'll call it statement B, and I'll leave it here first. Now let me look at lemma 2. This is what I have derived from lemma 2 just now. To lemma 2, to all instances of P, I substitute it with not P. To all instances of Q, I substitute it with not P. And as such, I'll derive this statement called statement A. Alright, called statement A. And therefore, when I combine statement A and B, I'll get this. Because statement A essentially shows that I can flip my conjunction around this way. And I apply statement A to statement B, I flip my conjunction around, I'll get this thing. Alright? And then we take definition 2. We take definition 2, which is the law of simplification, and we apply it to this statement. We apply it to this statement. You will be able to show that not P strictly implies P, which now is proven. Let us prove the theorem now. You will take lemma 3, which is here. This is lemma 3. To lemma 3, for all instances of P, you substitute it with not P. So over here, you convert this to not P, and to the consequence, you also convert it to not P, and you will get this. And I take this, I combine it with lemma 3 again. I combine it via axiom 6. I combine it with the associative principle. I will get this, because this quadruple not P will transmit to P, and I'll get this. And then I apply definition 2 to it. Sorry, not definition 2. I apply definition 1 to it. That's my bad. Realized that I made a mistake. I apply the definition of strict implication to it. I can convert this material conditional into the impossibility statement. Definition 1, not definition 2. Typo. Upon having this, I essentially take lemma 2 to reverse the order of conjunction. I reverse the order of conjunction of this. Not P goes to the left side, quadruple not P goes to the right side. I will get this statement upon applying lemma 2. And then I apply definition 2 to this statement. Oh, definition 1. Again, my apologies. I should have edited all this beforehand. This 3 should be definition 1 instead of definition 2. I made a last minute change and forgot to edit this slide. I apply definition 1 to it to convert the impossibility statement back to the material conditional. I'll call this statement C. Now I will take lemma 3. Alright, I'll take lemma 3. Lemma 3 is over here. Now not P strictly implies that P. I take lemma 3. I substitute all instances of P with not P. So I convert this P to not P, I convert this P to not P. Then I'll get triple not P strictly implies that not P. I'll call this statement D. Now I'll take statement D and C and I'll apply axiom 6 to it. I will take not P and I will transmit its I will transmit the truth of not P into triple not P, and I will transmit the truth of triple not P into not P. So this transmission is done using the definition of biconditional equivalence. Using the biconditional, I show that this one implies not P if and only if triple not P. I'll call this statement F. Now I'll take lemma 1. Lemma 1 is once again the lemma of identity. P strictly implies that P. So I take P strictly implies that P, and then I take definition 2. To definition 2, sorry, this one. Yeah, this should be definition 1 instead, not definition 2. To definition 1, P strictly implies that P will become impossible that P and not P. I take definition 1, I replace all instances of Q with P. Alright, I'll get this. I call this statement E. So by combining statement E and F, I'm using the rule of substitution of strict equivalence. F shows that the biconditional is a strict equivalence, and E has the term not P. And in F, I show that not P is equivalent to triple not P. So I simply substitute the not P in E into triple not P, and I'll get this statement. And then finally, I apply definition 1 to it. I apply definition 1, which changes the impossibility into a strict equivalence, and I will prove that P strictly implies that not P. Proven. This is exactly the same as axiom A5. So I have proven without using double negation anywhere. I have proven without using double negation that P strictly implies that not P. And another common misconception is that when I perform steps like this, I'm using double negation. Like over here, I triple not P. And then when I use definition 1 on it, I remove one of the negation to not P. This is not an instance of double negation, because if you look at definition 1, what you are simply doing is taking not Q and substituting it with Q when I convert the conjunction into a material implication. So I'm simply erasing one of the negation signs. I'm not using double negation or anything of that matter to cancel out one negation sign. So in no instance across this proof did I use axiom A5. Therefore, A5 is not an axiom but a result of the other 7, or rather 6 axioms, because axiom 8 is not present in system S1. S1 only has 1 to 7. I showed that 5 can be derived from the rest of the axioms. So 5 is essentially redundant. Now let's move on to a new axiom that had been added by Lewis. A few years down the road, he added the existence axiom. The reason for adding this new axiom to all systems is that it makes it clearer. It makes it clearer the difference between strict implication and material implication. In material implication, we can deduce by adding a first order logic operator. There exists a P and there exists a Q such that if P then Q or P then not Q, it gives you all possible combinations of material implication. If you draw out the truth table, you will be able to derive this. I will derive the complete result when I talk about classical logic, because it requires a bit of explanation, but let's just take this as a theorem of classical logic. This is normal classical logic material implication. Alright, over here, when I do it on strict implication and I use this axiom, it is not the case that P strictly implies Q, and not the case that P strictly implies not Q. If I compare this with this, let's say I replace the strict implication sign with a material implication symbol to compare the difference between strict and material implication. Let's take P arrow Q as A, and let's take P arrow not Q as B. So this one will be converted after changing strict implication into material implication to the first order logic statement. There exists a P and there exists a Q such that not A and not B. Over here it will become A or B. A or B is true in the cases where A true, B false, A false, B true, and A true, B true. A or B, this is an inclusive disjunction, because in classical logic the or is not either or. When both sides of the or are true, then the disjunction will be true. The only case where this statement is false is when A, not A, and not B, where both sides are false. And this is exactly the case. Material implication shows that when you simply replace this sign with the material implication sign, it will become not A and not B, which is the only case where this theorem is false in strict implication. What does this mean? What does this entail? This shows you that material implication and strict implication are very different. You will not get modal logic simply by replacing all material implication symbols with the strict implication symbols. There are other nuances involved that prevents you from doing a direct translation of it. And this axiom will be known as the existence axiom for strictness. And then we only introduce systems S1, S2, and S3 just now. Now we're just going to touch on system S4 and S5, which are the more important systems arguably. So Becker actually proposed axioms C10 and C12. When you combine system S1 with C10, you will get the system S4. And you combine system S1 with C10 and C12, you will get system S5. S5 is a very important modal system. It is one of the most studied systems in modal logic. And it has been used in things like the modal ontological argument, in things like mind-body dualism. So S5 is very important, and we're going to study S5 in huge depth and detail after this. But not yet, because we're still talking about the historical background of modal logic. all seemed well just now. We have proven the results, we have refined it, we have proven the counterintuitive result, we refined the axioms, we proved that double negation is redundant, we removed it. It seemed like a perfect axiomatic system for modal logic. But we run into kind of a huge problem. We realize that we can actually derive two other, what we call the so-called paradoxes of strict implication. Like just now, when I talk about Russell's two theorems, you can call them the paradoxes of material implication, because they are true but at the same time they seem false, seem really weird, counterintuitive. You can derive something similar to strict implication. We realize that even after putting the modal primitive operator, you can come up with instances where vacuous truth and simplification can also occur, but you simply restrict it to a subset of logical formulas in which these two paradoxes will occur. Paradox 1: an impossible proposition implies anything. Instead of saying, if Trump is the president of India, let us use this statement instead. If 2 plus 2 equals to 5, then Paris is in India. Mathematical statements, especially arithmetics, are necessary truths. There's no possible world where you can have 2 plus 2 equals to 5 and at the same time have the rest of the system of arithmetics without leading to a logical contradiction. Therefore, 2 plus 2 equals to 5 is a necessary truth. Alright, it's a necessary truth. 2 plus 2 equals to 4 is a necessary truth. But then, 2 plus 2 equals to 5 is necessarily false, because there is no possible world where 2 plus 2 equals to 5 can exist without a logical contradiction. So 2 plus 2 equals to 5 is impossible. But let us take this statement and we use strict implication to encode this. 2 plus 2 equals to 5 strictly implies that Paris is in India, will be what I mean by the theory of strict implication. And if I paraphrase it, strict implication can be paraphrased as, it is necessary that P implies Q. This is another paraphrasing of the definition of strict implication. I didn't really introduce it at the start because we didn't really need a necessity operator, but you can show that this thing holds. So when we make this statement, we are essentially saying that in all possible worlds, if 2 plus 2 equals to 5, then Paris is in India. But the thing is, in every single possible world, 2 plus 2 equals to 5 is false, right? 2 plus 2 equals to 5 is impossible. So in all possible worlds, it is false. But in every single possible world, because 2 plus 2 equals to 5 is false, you can apply vacuous truth to each possible world. So in every single possible world, this strict conditional will become vacuously true. When I talk about strict conditionals, I'm looking at all possible worlds. But when I look at individual possible worlds, classical logic applies to it. Classical logic applies to statements in each possible world. In every possible world, the conditional is vacuously true. And if the conditional is true in every single possible world, it makes the conditional necessarily true. And therefore, this statement, if 2 plus 2 equals to 5, then Paris is in India, will be necessarily true. So, as a result of 2 plus 2 equals to 5 being false, being impossible and false, it implies anything in a consequence. It implies that Paris is in India in all possible worlds. It implies that 2 plus 2 equals to 7 in all possible worlds. It can imply anything, which is a huge paradox also, considering the fact that Lewis tried to resolve this kind of issues, but then you can derive restricted, more specific problems that contravenes our common conception of natural language. Let's look at the second paradox. A necessary proposition is implied by anything. Let's use a different statement now to exemplify this. If Paris were in India, then 2 plus 2 equals to 4. 2 plus 2 equals to 4 is a necessary proposition. In all possible worlds, 2 plus 2 equals to 4. Numerical truths are necessary truths. This is commonly taken as a fact in philosophy. It's very hard to find someone who denies that this is a necessary truth. When you interpret it with a strict conditional, from our definition that I introduced beforehand, definition 1, I'm basically saying by the theory of strict implication, if Paris were in India, it strictly implies that 2 plus 2 equals to 4. So this means that it is not possible that Paris is in India and 2 plus 2 is not equals to 4. However, the thing is that it is true that this strict implication holds, because when I look at not Q, it means that 2 plus 2 is not equals to 4, and this doesn't hold in any possible world. No matter the value of P, because I use a conjunction here, it implies that it is impossible that P and not Q, because not Q is impossible. So it is impossible that P and not Q. Therefore, it validates this statement, this strict implication. And as such, as long as you have a proposition that is necessarily true, it is implied by any antecedent in your strict conditional. So, in conclusion, we have ended up with two major issues that are still unresolved in modal logic, and you'll soon realize that despite the fact that Lewis was initially motivated to come up with modal logic to solve the paradoxes of material conditional, namely vacuous truths and the principle of simplification, we realize that what he has instead done is, despite all the hard work, he has only come up with a system of logic that's more complicated, but also yields similar paradoxes, albeit subsets of the initial paradoxes. So his original intention has not really been met yet. He is now faced with an even more challenging set of paradoxes that can't really be solved by changing syntax alone. But you realize that as time went on, people started embracing material implication in classical logic. People started embracing vacuous truth. People started embracing principle of simplification. They thought that these two things, they argued that, well, these two things may in fact be rational. These two things are very important. There's no use, and they also consider the fact that natural language can't really be completely translated into classical logic, into formal logic, because there's too much nuance going on in classical logic, and people may mean different things when saying the same sentence. Classical logic, or rather natural language, is not really well formed in this sense. So interestingly, modal logic has continued to develop. They didn't throw it away even when they abandoned hopes of replacing the paradoxes of material implication. Instead, modal logic has been discovered to be very useful in many other fields, and when other prominent logicians came along, like Carnap, Gödel, and Kripke, modal logic has seen an explosion essentially, and now it's applied in many other fields. You can apply it in applied philosophy, you can apply it in computing, and that's what I'm trying to get to. In the next few videos which I'll upload, I will just basically share the development of modal logic from this point. And what I'm trying to get to is to move towards a stage where I can start explaining Kripkean semantics, I can start explaining the formal aspects of relational semantics, and hopefully move on to more complex and advanced topics on modal logic that I know about.